أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So I want to get started and just wanted to focus on starting off with just check-ins, but today's check-ins are going to be a little bit different. I'm going to actually explore a little bit of what it is that you guys are struggling with. So I know that what happens oftentimes is we want to have goals, but we don't have time allocated towards setting goals. We want to have certain visions, we want to have a certain direction we want to go into, but we find ourselves that we're not actually allocating a specific time where we sit down and actually discuss or analyze what kind of goals that we want to have. So we just sort of think in our head, okay, I want to do this and I want to do that, and we feel like that's sufficient, that's enough or whatever. But in reality, we might actually not have anything really mapped out, right, on a piece of paper or something like that. So I wanted to focus on that a little bit. So how has your week been? How have you been progressing towards your vision and goals? And have you been unable to set a vision and goals? So this is where, I ask the question to see how things are going. And then if people say, for example, well, we're still struggling or we haven't really done whatever. So this is my next question here. Have you been unable to set a vision and goals, right? Now this could be because you're procrastinating or because you don't know how to do it, because you don't know how to set a vision and goals and stuff like that. So that could be one of the causes. Also, what are some ways that you're assessing your progress in various areas? So how are you actually assessing if you're making progress towards something or if you're not making progress? How are you evaluating yourself? How are you analyzing things and stuff like that? So this is that question. Today's topic is going to be about relations. That's the category that I was talking about earlier, or that's the topic, right? The concept. So last time it was Common Core. Today I was going to talk about relationships, and I broke it down into 4 general relationships, right? And you see that they're pretty much the same, right? So the idea is there's different type of relationships that we have, and the steps 0, 1, and 2 are going to come in a slightly different way than you might have noticed in previous case studies, right? But here, what I want to do is focus on the case study of relationships as the topic, right? So the case study is relationships, and the relationships. What I mean by this is obviously family, so the spouses, parenting, children, and relatives and so on. But you can also extend that to your co-workers and friends and other people and stuff like that. So I didn't include this today. I just wanted to make this kind of sort of brief a little bit, inshallah, to whatever degree possible. But in the meantime, let's get started with this. So notice that I have 4 things in each of these. So the objectives, meaning the objectives between, in the case of spouses, what's the objective of spouses, right? What's the objective between 2 people coming together, for example? What is the objective of parenting, for example, right? What is the objective of being among siblings? What is the relationship objective between siblings, for example, right? And same thing with relatives. And the expectations are a little bit different here. So they are connected to objectives, right? But they're a little bit different in the sense that what is each side going to expect from the other? So what is the objective is sort of the end goal, right? But what is sort of the daily, what are the expectations? And so the expectations could be what I'm going to be expecting from, let's say, my sibling, right? And how, what are the expectations in terms of connected to the objectives, but also connected to reality, right? So there's 2 types of expectations here. There's the expectation based on, how, what kind of behavior I should expect versus if I'm assuming that the person is going with the objectives, and then what kind of expectation should I have when it comes to the reality of how people work, right? So this is for example, although he wants to work on this, but in reality he has these shortcomings, and so he may not be able to do this and that and that. Does that make sense? There's a difference between expectations, which are connected to whatever your goal is, right? Versus whatever the reality looks like, whether you're gonna, whether the trajectory is towards the objectives or not. So there's the expectation of like, and the rights over here linked to that same thing. So when I give examples inshallah, maybe it'll make more sense. So for example, when it comes to spouses, the objectives are, among the objectives, right, Islamically, is so that you have obviously, some person that you can connect with and you can carry forward with. When Adam alayhi salam was created, Allah Azza wa Jalla also created Hawa alayhi salam, and this was a person that was gonna sort of be that person that you can sort of find comfort in, right? So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala mentions in the Quran for spouses, hunna libasul lakum, they, meaning your wives and stuff in this case, are like a comfort, like a garment sort of for you and stuff, right? hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun, and you are garments for them, right? So the idea of like finding that companionship, finding that like comfort, finding that safe space between spouses and stuff. So that's one of the objectives over here. Like this is what it does, right? Now spouses also come together for procreation. Obviously, you have intimacy and so on. So that's another thing, because you have certain needs. Everyone, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala designed this a certain way that we have certain needs and desires and so on. So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala also helps you fulfill them in a way that's okay, right? And that's going to be not harmful to society and different people and so on. So this is what I mean by objectives. This is why they're coming together. Now, when they come together, obviously they have rights. So, for example, there are certain rights that a husband has, and there are certain rights that a wife has, right? And both sides are focused more on making sure that they're doing their part on delivering their rights, like fulfilling the rights of the other person in that relationship, because Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is going to ask them about the rights that the other person had on them, right? And both sides are going to be accountable for that. So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is going to just like pretty much judge between who it is, or between like the two spouses essentially. Like the husband had this right, did the wife had this right, did the husband fulfill that, or did they not, right? So this is that. So this is what I mean by rights. And the rights are important over here because these rights are a way to sustain relationships, to sustain certain things, right? If a person's right is taken away, then that person is not going to be able to continue maintaining that relationship, or to like provide their aspect, their side of this, their contribution to the relationship essentially, right? So for example, if let's say one of the spouses does not fulfill one of their rights, the other one is going to be impacted negatively. So the one who didn't fulfill the rights of the other one, the second one, the one whose rights are not being fulfilled, is going to have some sort of difficulty in their ability to maintain that relationship. So this is important. This applies to all of the different ones. So I'm giving you just like a general thing so you can understand how it can also apply to all of them, right? So I don't want to go into like too many details just yet. I just want to give you an introduction of what I mean by rights. So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has designated rights based on what is most likely going to happen in these relationships. Okay, so what is a wife going to expect from her husband, and that's going to help her? What does she need? Not only expectations, but what does she need from her husband that is going to help her sort of like continue on in this relationship? And then what does the husband need in the relationship that's going to help him continue and maintaining a positive relationship? Is that right? So the idea is that the rights are addressing specific needs that are generally going to appear in different relationships. Okay, so that's very important over here. If that need is not fulfilled, then the person whose needs are not being fulfilled is going to feel overwhelmed, and they're not going to be able to sustain their side of their contribution to the relationship. Okay, so this is very important over here. The rights are also therefore connected in terms of the sustainability of the relationship, and if they do account for the needs of people in that relationship. So let me give you an example for parenting. So I'm going to give you an example of this, right? So let's say that the parents, because because when you're young and stuff, they're taking care of you and so on. So when you get a little bit older, and some of the kids, for example, they might rebel against their parents, or they might like be rude to them, or like they might talk back to them or whatever and stuff, right? So when the parents are raising the kids, they have this thing that they're putting all this time and effort, and they're investing and so on, right? And they have this concern, and they're looking out for their well-being and stuff, right? They're pretty much like waking up in the middle of the night, changing diapers, or like making sure that the person, like the child, is happy and so on. So these things that they're doing, they are essentially going to be hurt if they don't get certain things in return. Now, a person might say, well, well, the parents are doing this and this is like their choice and all that stuff. True, it is, right? In the sense that, you got married and stuff, you wanted to have kids and stuff, so you decide that you're going to make that decision. However, human beings, when they put some time and effort into some things, they generally would like at least an appreciation or some sort of like indication that it wasn't all wasted. Essentially, that all the stuff that they did wasn't for no reason and stuff, right? And that their kindness and their generosity and their love and all that wasn't just wasted at the end. They didn't get any kind of fruit at the end of the day, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows this already, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put down certain rules for children to follow, right? At the same time, if you go in the other way, there are certain things that kids need, and if they don't get these things, then they're not going to be able to continue maintaining a positive relationship. For example, if the parents are a certain way where they're just like, for example, not taking care of the kids, they're just like, the kids are sort of like, malnutrition, like let's say that they don't have any kind of like education, for example, they're not being taught anything, and there's means available for the parents, right? But the parents are just not caring about the kids. They're not taking care of them in terms of like their deen, in terms of their education, in terms of their food, in terms of their like clothing and stuff, in terms of like like a living space or whatever. The parents are not doing that stuff. They're just sort of like in their own world, and the kids are sort of like just doing whatever. And I'm gonna give you an example to give you an idea of this. So there was a story where I think one of the Asian countries, I'm not sure if it was China or Japan, but one of them, one of these Asian countries, there was this case where the parents got involved into like a game, right? There was an online virtual reality game, and there they started raising a child, right? So they were raising a child in there, and they started fixating so much on raising that child virtually, a child, their whatever the virtual game child was, whatever. They started, investing so much time in it that they ended up neglecting their own infant child. And I think, if I remember correctly, that infant child ended up dying. So in that case, the parents did not fulfill their rights of the kids. So the kids have rights and the parents have rights. So there's this balance between the two, right? So these things are important. Another thing, for example, could be, and this applies to all four cases here, all four, and it can apply to co-workers and friends and so on. It can apply to so many different places, right? And the idea of like abuse could be, for example, physical, emotional, it could be mental, it could be like whatever. So it could be, for example, you saying bad things to a person, just making them feel like they're worthless, right? Whether it's as a parent saying that to their kids, or a kid saying that to their father or mother, or as it's between spouses, husband and wife saying that to each other, or you're saying that to somebody that like this is like a cyberbullying nowadays, for example, doing it online, or doing it on the playground, or whatever it is, right? The idea of bullying somebody, being like toxic to another person, that right there is going to be sort of going into certain boundaries that you're not allowed to cross, right? So these are the general interaction etiquettes and the expectation as well. So if you have a spouse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about one of his signs is that he has created from among you your spouses. So that you can have sort of sakina between two of them, right? وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and he made between you mawadda, which is like affection and kindness and all that, and like a different kind of love, because there's like mahabba, there's ishq, and there's like mawadda and stuff. So there's different kinds of loves in Arabic. Mawadda is more like affection, like the kind of person that you are. So this is like you're just nice and loving and so on, right? And this word mawadda is from the same root word as the word al-wadud. Al-wadud is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the most loving, right? And this is similar to, this is the same root word as what the Prophet ﷺ encouraged in terms of getting married to like people. And in this case, he's saying marry certain women, and he's mentioning the word that these people have like mawadda between them and other people, for example, whether there's their kids or their husband and so on. So they're like, this is their characteristic. So this is the kind of loving person they are, right? So a typical example that you might think of is like a grandmother taking care of their grandchild and stuff, like a very loving person. It's a very like they're caring for them and stuff. They're sort of like even like the person that you make a mistake and you go to them and they're like hey, they hug you and they talk to you about like whatever you made a mistake and how to navigate and stuff, right? So that kind of personality, right? So that kind of characteristic that you have. So this would be a person who has this like this quality of um, being loving, right? So Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and He made mercy between the two of you, right? So this is important over here. So this is the idea. If that gets exploited, so in terms of expectations, if that gets disconnected, then or if it's not present, then this can impact the relationship in a very negative way, right? And that can lead to like toxicity, and like it can lead to cycles of toxicity, and it can lead to a lot of mental health impacts, and that's very detrimental to society in general, right? Let alone just the family unit, but it can be very pervasive because that person, let's say a child, is being abused for whatever reason, like they're being mocked and insulted and ridiculed and stuff like that. And these are not positive things, whether it's in parenting or whether it's like siblings, whether it's friends, whether it's like co-workers. These type of behaviors are never okay, right? Because Allah Subhanahu wa Taala mentions in Surah Al-Hujurat and other places how we should interact with people. So if somebody is like constantly like mocking another person or constantly insulting them and demeaning them and like all these things, then in that case the other person is not being given their right of respect and like kindness and generosity and stuff like that. So that person's rights are being taken away. So if that person then retaliates in the way of like, for example, like also mocks you back or like like is rude to you and stuff, right? Then it makes sense where that comes from. And it's not okay for us to expect that other people should be okay with us being toxic towards them, and that that's it. So this is something that to keep in mind for all of these cases that I mentioned over here, because siblings can be toxic to each other, and parents can be toxic to children, and children can be toxic to parents, and spouses can be toxic to each other, and relatives can be toxic to each other, and so on. There's a lot of this stuff that goes on, and obviously a lot of this stuff could be connected back to insecurities, because the person might feel unsafe with regard to something, so they react in a certain way, and that like they're trying to sort of like salvage their rights back and stuff like that if they feel the rights have been taken away. Now, sometimes that could be misappropriated because they might feel insecure relative to one person, right? Somebody might have like abused them a certain way, but then they take it out on somebody else. So a bully could be abused elsewhere, right? Let's say at home they're being bullied, for example, and so they come to the school and they try to bully somebody else and stuff, right? Just because they need like in this case this is misappropriation or misallocation of whatever the mischanneling, let's say, of their their insecurity or their hurt and like all that. So keeping this in mind over here, let me give you some examples, or let me tell you why I was mentioning this. As you know, especially in the recent decades, right? You've noticed that there has been a significant increase in mental health crises, right? Or mental health cases. We have a lot of these situations that come up when we work with youth, when we work with like assisting the imams, for example, in terms of cases that come up. So what happens is that a lot of these cases end up where people are not trained Islamically in terms of how to be spouses or how to be parents or how to be children. Actually, children a little bit more, they are trained in the sense that this is this expectation from the kids and from people that are underneath the authority, right? They are sort of expected already to be a certain way, right? A lot of times we don't actually have training for the people that are in authority, right? For example, in the case of parenting, there's no there's no requirement. For example, Islamically, there is this understanding that you should go to this, but I'm saying in terms of like marriage licenses and so on, when people get married, to get the marriage license, there isn't a requirement for you to have gone through a course on how to be spouses. When you become parents, there isn't like at the hospital, they're not going to ask you, for example, hey, before we hand over this child to you, show a certification that you've actually graduated from a university of how to be a parent, for example, or you've taken certain courses on how to be a parent and stuff, right? And people might get offended with what I'm saying, but it's one of the things that we need to understand is that relationships need to be understood in terms of how we need to interact with people, and Islam actually has a lot of emphasis on this. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ has, and there's multiple narrations on this, but one in summary, in translation, the Prophet ﷺ uses the word innama to imply exclusivity, to imply that this is the main purpose he was sent, and he says innama bu'ithtu لِأُتَمِّمَ, and then he mentions like different versions at the end of the hadith. So it's, I was only sent to perfect. And then it mentions a good character, noble character, perfect character, and there's different riwayat, different narrations on this, the different words that were used for describing, this thing. So, and all of them focus on perfecting character, good character, noble character, perfect character, and so on. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying that it's as if he's saying that the usage of the word innama, it's as if to say that he was the main reason he was sent was to perfect good character, right? If we perfect the character, and that's one of the heaviest things in the scales in the Day of Judgment, if we perfect that between, within our relationships, whatever relationship we have, then it makes a huge difference. But when we don't do that, we don't learn what the proper etiquettes are, we don't understand what manners are and stuff, we don't have this tarbiyah when we're growing up, for example, then in that case, we can be propagating a lot of harm and dhulm, like oppression. We could be like causing a lot of toxicity in our context, in our societies, and so on, right? And that's because we didn't learn the proper etiquette. We didn't learn from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, the rights of different people. And then we didn't understand, for example, what's okay and what's not. So, for example, Sheikh Akasha from the Al-Hifz Institute, he doesn't teach any course unless the students go to the first prerequisite course, and that is khuluqan azim. That the ayah وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. In Surah Al-Qalam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the Prophet having this great perfect character and stuff, right? And the Prophet had this character, and so in Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a lot of details about manners and stuff like that. So if you go to Surah Al-Hujurat and look at the tafsir and the lessons that you can extract from there, so Shaykh Al-Kashaf, he goes into detailed analysis of Surah Al-Hujurat in terms of how you can perfect your character, and he does that before he teaches the students any other course. So if you don't take that course, you're not allowed to take any of the courses that like any other courses in the institute. So this is because if you don't understand manners, if you don't understand how to interact with people, you're not going to be able to give them their dues and their rights and so on, and that can lead to bad consequences at the end of the day. So tarbiyah is something that you can get, for example, tarbiyah in English could be like pedagogy and stuff, right? So tarbiyah, as you're growing up, your parents raise you in a certain way and so on. So this etiquette, this manners, this this way of this navigating different scenarios and so on, this is tarbiyah. So if you have this and you grow up and you have this, you're getting the idea of how to interact with people. But you need to make sure, the parents need to make sure that it's aligned with the Quran and the Sunnah and so on. If it's not connected to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down, then it's like an experiment that you're doing with your kids. You're telling them something, and then they grow up and they do those things and stuff, and you haven't actually verified if this is how you're supposed to interact with people or not, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how different people are going to be impacted by different behaviors, and so He gave us a code of conduct that we need to follow, right? So for example, in the ayat that talk about covering for women, right? In these ayat, the story, one of them, the story goes where Umar radiallahu anh, for example, Umar Khattab radiallahu anh, he was asking the Prophet ﷺ to ask his wives, meaning the Ummahat al-Mu'minin, the mothers of the believers, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. Umar radiallahu anh, suggested that the Prophet ﷺ asked them to cover themselves in a way so that they won't be bothered by people and stuff, and they would be protected and their honor would be safe and so on, right? The Prophet ﷺ didn't go with it immediately until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed verses to support Umar radiallahu anhu's stance here. And so one of the verses, it notes in here فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ, so that they would not be annoyed or bothered or whatever, right? So this is one of the objectives behind the covering and so on. Now, and I'm not gonna try to simplify it too much and stuff, but I want to make a connection. I want to draw a connection between these kinds of I guess regular guidelines for the Muslim women, right? If the guys and the girls follow certain etiquette Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down, right? When it comes to interaction between opposite genders and stuff, when it comes to whatever, then in that case there would be a lot more safety and security in the society, and things like the Me Too movement would not happen. Why? Because when it comes to guys, they're told in the ayah, for example, in Surah An-Nur, mentions قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and then it mentions that they should tell the believing men that they should lower their gazes, and then the next ayah says and قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, tell the believing women that they should lower their gazes and stuff, right? So the idea over here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands that there are certain differences in terms of how men and women think, right? In terms of like what drives them, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accounts for that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions first to men because they're more likely to fall into these things, and then he talks to women right after that. So if a man like protects himself in a certain way, like he lowers his gaze and stuff, it's less likely for certain things to take place. For example, sexual abuse, for example, and so on. It's less likely to take place if the guys are taking their active measures first and foremost, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also alerts women in the next ayah and tells them to do it, right? So the scholars noted, for example, the order of the verses. The first one went to men, so it implies that they're weaker in this stance, and so it's more beneficial for them to lower their gazes. And then they mention women after that. The next ayah is talking to women, so there's like this element of benefit over here, that the order of these ayat are important over here. And so in this case right here, if they were properly following these protocols, then the likelihood of these kinds of negative behaviors would be decreased, essentially, right? And so that's the idea. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given rights, and he has given proper etiquette in terms of interaction that help in terms of minimizing the harm that could take place otherwise. And when we don't connect with it, we don't learn those etiquettes, we don't learn those rights and objectives and so on, what ends up happening is we do a trial and error method, and we are essentially testing as guinea pigs. And I know I'm simplifying this, but I hope the message is getting across that when we don't learn these things, we don't learn what the proper etiquettes are, we don't learn the rights of the other people in our relationships and stuff, right? The other sides, then in that case we're doing a trial and error, and we're treating as the other people in the relationship as guinea pigs. Let me do this to see how this person is gonna react to whatever, right? And then I continue doing this, thinking that I'm okay in whatever I'm doing, until there's a backlash, or there's harm that the other person experiences, and so they react in a certain way, right? And because I'm the one instituting, I'm the one initiating this, then in that case, I'm the one therefore causing this harm, and that the retaliation or whatever response it is, I'm the one that's sort of accountable for that a little bit more than the other person, although the other person is still responsible for whatever it is that they're doing. Now, this is important because if you also go back to when we discussed the Black Lives Movement scenario, there was this whole social experiment that took place, and the idea was that they figured that the only way to maintain slavery of black people, as opposed to just randomized slavery, meaning slavery of anyone, right? To justify why it should be black people that they're using as slaves and stuff, they started having some sort of concept instituted or presented in the society. And so what happens is they started justifying why it's black people that being enslaved, and why is it not for example brown people or other people that are being enslaved. So they needed a justification process for that, and so there was a justification that they made and stuff for that. Anyways, so they started treating them in a negative way, and that negative way continued for many centuries. And and then people started sort of feeling the impact of that. There was a lot of unrest, and that makes complete sense, right? If you're being treated a certain way that does not match with who you really are, right? Then in that case, then you're gonna feel a certain way, and so you're gonna respond a certain way. And so this is where you see a lot of resistance and stuff. The idea of the slave, the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. Initially, there was a lot of push that was, obviously we know that Abraham Lincoln had a difficult time navigating that scenario, and he wasn't completely on board on, just a flat, black and white are equal and stuff, and there's no difference or whatever. He wasn't on board with that, but there was building pressure. And obviously the North and South had different views on that, and so that's where the Civil War was coming in as well as one of the driving forces behind it. And so when these things were happening, people were feeling that this is wrong, and then they were resisting, and other people were coming into the picture and stuff, and so, and then it kind of just built up, and then there were riots. If you remember, in the 60s and 70s and stuff like that, there was a lot of first there was also the idea of the segregation, and then they were resisting segregation and stuff, and then they were having the sit-ins and stuff, and there was a lot of these things that were continuing onwards because people were resisting, and they said this is not right. We are not getting the rights that we deserve, and you're treating us in a way that we do not, that does not match with who we are. You're treating us in a way that does not match with who we are, right? And so that led to a lot of harm and so on. Now, if you look at revolutions, that happened recently, for example, the Arab Springs and others, you'll notice the same thing that's happening over there as well, where people felt like, okay, this is not how we should be treated, and we're continuously being treated like this, and we're going to revolt, essentially, right? Now, the fiqh behind revolts and stuff, whether it's okay, whether it's not okay, we're not getting into that. We're just trying to understand why these things happen in the first place, right? We're not saying what is right and what is wrong. We're just saying why it's happening. So you can really understand why people react in a certain way. Now, I'm going to mention another issue, which is Israel and Palestine. It makes sense, right, when a person feels like their lives are being threatened, or when their families are being threatened, or when they're not being when they're not given access to basic necessities of existence, like water, clean water, and like food access and like things like that and stuff, right? Then they're gonna revolt in one way or another. They're gonna feel oppressed and they're gonna revolt, right? So whatever, again, the rights and wrongs, we're not getting into the rights and wrongs. We're just talking about does it make sense for us to does it make sense in terms of like why people are reacting in a certain way, right? Why did the communities, the countries, the Arab countries, why did the people, the populations, feel a certain way to the extent that they said we're going to take down our leaders, for example? What was going wrong over there, right? That made them feel that way. And again, that's different than exceptional cases where the revolts could happen for no reason, for example, right? But in these cases, there was some justifiable reason and stuff. Okay, we are feeling that we're being oppressed. We're not getting what we need and stuff like that. Our people, our leaders are not are not taking our best interests, into consideration and so on. They're just, there's like a one-way thing. They're the only ones benefiting. We're not benefiting anything at all, right? So if this is how people feel, then they're going to revolt, and it makes sense. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given rights to rulers, but He has also given rights to the population, right? And if one side, goes off, then that can harm them a lot. That can harm the relationship a lot. And so when the Prophet ﷺ was sending Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen, he told them certain things. And one of the things he told them to be just and take care of the nicely. But one of the things he said that, and remember that the dua of the oppressed reaches its target, essentially, right? The dua of the oppressed is answered, meaning do not oppress, because the maghlum, the oppressed person, whether that person is Muslim or not, it doesn't matter. In these kind of scenarios, it doesn't matter who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is. The religions don't matter in this case. It's justice, right? Justice goes across boundaries and stuff, right? Across religions and so on. So if the leader, who's a Muslim, for example, and he's oppressing a non-Muslim under him, then in that case, the non-Muslim's dua is going to be accepted against the Muslim one, right? This is what we need to understand. Okay, so the Mu'adh bin Jabal, so this is the lesson that we learned from there, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to compensate the oppressed person. If the person's rights are not being given, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to compensate that person. So in America, for example, if people are being oppressed and let's say that the people, whoever are oppressing, are not taking things seriously, right? And they're just sort of thinking that they can do whatever they want, Allah will turn the tides. Allah will get the oppressed people out of position. They're gonna humiliate them or whatever. Allah is gonna do that, right? If the people are not actively supporting each other towards what's just, right? If there's injustice is taking place and people are not actively involved in stuff, then Allah is gonna interfere, right? Or if the people are actively involved but they're being overcome by the oppressors, for example, then Allah is gonna compensate for that, right? So it's not like, for example, me or you or whatever and stuff, right? It's as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to interfere. And it could be many different ways. It could be, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might send natural disasters. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might impact the economy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to do so many different things. There's so many different ways Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can handle that himself, right? But at the same time, we are supposed to stand for justice. And the ayah says in Surah An-Nisa, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم والوالدين والأقربين and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that, oh, you have believed, right? Stand firmly for justice. Stand for justice. كونوا قوامين بالقسط. You're standing for justice. You are the sort of like the guards of justice, essentially, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifies who that is against. It says ولو على أنفسكم, even if it's against yourselves. Awil walidain, or against your parents, right? It doesn't matter who that person is. If there's a matter of justice, justice needs to be served. Wal aqrabin, so or your relatives and stuff, right? So it doesn't matter who it is. If there's a matter of justice, justice needs to be served, right? The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, and he mentions in this ayah too, that as witnesses to us, I stand firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Rasulullah ﷺ mentioned one time, for example, about Fatima radiallahu anha. And Fatima, he said that the Prophet ﷺ said that, in terms of the punishment for stealing, it's cutting the hands off, right? One of the hands, it's the hand cutting off, and obviously there is a minimum amount after which this punishment instituted. Below that amount, the hands are not cut, right? And so above this amount, there is a cutting of the hand. And obviously, when we were talking about maqasid al-sharia and stuff, and we talked about punishments and the reasons for punishments, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishes, like these punishments are, they're intended, and they're severe, obviously, but they're intended to be a deterrent, but also the punishment is connected to the crime. As in, if a person spends a lot of time, like hard work and whatever and stuff, right, earning a certain amount of money, or getting certain property and stuff like that, and here comes another person, and he just thinks that he can just take whatever they want to take and stuff like that, and not gonna get punished much, and they might just have to pay a brief fine, or they might have to spend some time here and there in prison and stuff, but they'll come back and do the same thing, right? So that doesn't actually protect society, right? So if you know that you're actually gonna lose a limb, you're gonna think twice before you actually commit the crime. So it's less likely that you're going to commit crimes, because you know that there's a very harsh punishment, because somebody's rights are being taken away. But these are things that are basic necessities of people, right? Like money and property and stuff, and it's involved with your time commitment and your effort and your sweat and all that stuff, right? So if that's taken away, it's not protected, people are going to not be feeling safe, and so there's a punishment for a person who does this, because it impacts the psyche of a human being, because it's one of those fundamental needs, and some of those things that people need to have, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this punishment there. So the Prophet said, if my daughter Fatima bint Muhammad, if she stole something, then I would institute the same punishment on her, like cutting her hand. Because justice is justice. It doesn't matter if you're a king or you're a lay person. It doesn't matter who you are. If you are a daughter of a prophet, it doesn't matter. You're still going to get the same justice that's applied to everyone else, right? So these are some things to account for. Right? Now there are exceptions to this, and it depends on the leader. For example, if he sees that there is a context that pushed people to steal, for example, there was a time where there was a famine, and in the time of Umar radiallahu anh, and obviously there's a scarcity of food and so on. So Umar radiallahu anh temporarily lifted the punishment. Right? And again, he has Sahaba and stuff like that are agreeing with him, and the Sahaba are one of our authorities in legislation. So it's Quran, Sunnah, and the Sahaba, right? So Umar radiallahu anh with the Sahaba, they understood that there is a need that's not being currently met. So if a person stole in that context, then their hand is not going to be cut off, because they didn't do it out of no reason. They did it because maybe they're starving and stuff like that, right? And then there's some stuff behind this and stuff in terms of if a person was let's say if you're about to die and you stole somebody's food and stuff like that, right? Does that, and let's say you ask the person, can I get some food and stuff, and the person doesn't give you any food and you're dying and stuff, is it okay for you to steal and stuff? There's this kind of discussion and stuff, and the stealing would be to the extent of your need and not more than that, and so on. So in that case, there's some fiqh discussions and stuff like that. Is it okay? Is it not okay? And how do you navigate that? But I'm just saying that the idea is people's rights. If you're not fulfilling people's rights, if you don't know what they are in the first place, you can't fulfill them, right? Actively, consciously fulfill them. So it's very important for us to do that. Now, some things really quick before we finish, inshallah, is that there are so many cases that we come across, and the imams come across, right, where when we get to these cases and we start discussing, and when I say we, oftentimes we get referred to these cases through the imams or some other people. They ask for us to, and by us I mean our team of people. We have a team of people. So anyways, let's say we come to this case and we start looking at what's happening. We realized what's happening over here a lot of times, and this is the experience from my team, and the imams in the community will also say the same thing, because we discuss these things. So a lot of times you'll find out that most people don't know the rights of each other, and they haven't learned the Islamic etiquette of interaction between themselves and other people. Okay, whether it's parents and their kids, or whether it's husband and wife, a lot of these cases that come up, they haven't actually learned the etiquette of interaction. And so we come in and we realize that there's like this chaos essentially, right? It's just sort of like, okay, I want to do this, I want to do that and stuff, but we're not actually like going into details of how to like navigate these, not knowing that. So it's like a trial and error kind of thing. You're experimenting with other people in your lives. So if you have a loved one and you don't know what their rights are Islamically, and you're just doing whatever you think that is supposed to happen, then you are using your loved one as a guinea pig. If you have a blood relative or you have somebody in your family, whatever, you don't know what their rights are, you are treating them as guinea pigs essentially. It doesn't matter how much you say you love them or whatever. You can't really love them unless you're trying your best to make sure that they are satisfied and happy and stuff, right? Or whatever is best, whatever's in their best interest and stuff is being taken care of and stuff, right? You can't really do that unless you know about their rights. You know what the objective of your relationship is. You know what the expectations are from that person, so you don't ask them more than what's Islamically expected from them and so on, right? You know how to interact with them and stuff. You know how they're going to react to different scenarios and stuff. So for example, parents, it'll hurt them a lot more if a child is not respecting them, for example. If they were so nice and generous and they've always been nice and kind and stuff, and they see the child responding oppositely, it hurts them a lot more because you literally grew up in front of them and stuff, and they raised you bi'idhnillah. So it hurts them a lot more. So therefore, they're compensated for that in a way with more rights than most other people might have over you, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So that the rights that they have are connected also to the amount of work that they've done, right? And the kind of efforts that they've put through and stuff. So understanding that makes a difference. Now, what if, for example, a parent does not fulfill their rights, right? So in that case, they are perpetuating certain harm on the kids. And I know personally from working with youth and different families and stuff, that this kind of stuff is one of the most common things. And the unfortunate situation is that most parents have not gone through training on how to be parents, and it does impact families a lot. And most spouses, most people that get married, do not go through some sort of like Islamic course and like what the rights are of each other and stuff like that. And so they don't know these things. It's all like arbitrary. It's all like random and stuff. They just come in. They just sort of follow other people who, like, let's say they'll follow their parents or they'll follow somebody else they admire or whatever. That's it. They're gonna copy and paste and stuff, and that's it. They're not gonna actually customize for the person themselves. In fact, they're also not gonna know if what other people were doing was actually right or not. Right. So we need to understand Islamically what the rights and obligations are, because a lot of these things that are not actually discussed on the minbar, they're not discussed in the khutbahs, right? Because imams need to focus on certain like things that they get asked about most often. Like they might get asked about wudu related stuff or fasting related stuff or whatever. So the imams are going to answer those things a lot on the khutbah when most people are coming in, because as we know, most of us don't actually attend the classes that the imams do offer regularly, right? So the imams need to find opportunity, whatever opportunity they get of mass gatherings, they're going to present the most common topics and stuff, right? That people are asking about. But the things that the imams get in terms of in terms of what the things that the imams get in terms of special cases, right? You're going to find out that a lot of these cases have these issues and stuff inside. People don't know people's rights. They don't have the etiquette and understanding how to navigate different contexts. They don't know how to navigate conflicts within particular relationships, and they don't know the objectives of various relationships. Like, what's the objective of parenting, right? What is it that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala expects from you as a parent? What is it that Allah expects from you as a husband or as a wife, right? What is it that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala expects from you as a child? What is it that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala expects from you as a friend? What are these things? Like, we don't actually explore this, and so we're arbitrarily testing whatever we think on other people until bad things happen, until like the rights that we didn't know about, so we didn't fulfill, it ends up leading to a certain negative consequence, and then we become like toxic because we go back and forth, and fights happen and things like that, and we don't want to break the cycle and so on, and we just perpetuate this on and on and on. So I wanted to take some time today to discuss some of these things. Maybe next time I'll go into some examples, actual examples of actual cases that have taken place. So let me give you just a hint on some of them, right? We've had situations where the kids became overwhelmed, for example, and they started having toxic personalities and stuff because of the way that the parents were treating them at home, and so like, obviously they would be like abusing them or whatever. Like, I don't mean like, for example, like discipline and stuff, right? I mean like being overcritical meaning like very like insulting and mocking and like, all these things and stuff. So that's very different than if you discipline, in terms of like, like slips here and there. For example, the child made a mistake here and like whatever, so you discipline them and you give them like a timeout, or you like, like whatever like, you might do. North Carolina actually has a certain law, for how a parent can discipline children. So let's say that, a parent fulfills like is within that boundary, and they're doing it reasonably. They like both sides know, okay, like the child knew that if they didn't do this and this and stuff, this is what's gonna happen. They like, it's just something beneficial, it's good and stuff. It's not like, for example, if you burn yourself, and in that case, like, if you don't burn yourself, I'm gonna like hit you or something like that, right? That's completely unreasonable. That does not go with step zero, right? And that does not, is not for the benefit of the child, right? Well, for example, if a child is being, let's say, like it's like breaking things in the house, for example, and just going all over the place and all that, right? And then and this is just like, random tantrums that happen, for example, but then the child is otherwise like, like normal in the sense like they're not having a mental health crisis and stuff. But let's say that, one day they just get really upset and they're like, what, like, I'm not gonna listen to you, and they do something, whatever. So in that case, a parent disciplines, for example, that's a very different scenario than like being overly critical all the time, right? And like always like calling the person like fat or ugly, or like, you're so stupid or whatever and stuff, right? These kinds of like words can have a really big impact. And so this is where the parent is actually going to take blame, and they're not actually fulfilling the objectives or the rights or the etiquette of being parents towards their kids, right? Because the kids are going to be learning a lot from their parents. I know a case, for example, where um, there was a child, uh, like in one of the masajid, for example, and somebody was telling him to like not do something. Like they were making sure that they, like something is like a setting is organized a certain way, and an activity is done in the right way, for example, in a safe way. But then the child got upset and he didn't want to follow the instructions, and so like the father egged him on to like, sort of defend himself by cursing the person who was like, like overseeing the activity. So the father is the one that's telling him to like fight for himself and like, curse the other person and to like be like negative like that, be toxic. The father is training the child to be like that, right? And so this is where the father is definitely wrong, and he's the one who's going to take the blame on this. But at the same time, that could be because the father never understood what Islam is all about. He didn't understand what good manners are and stuff. He didn't understand what an objective of a parent should be towards, upbringing of their kid and so on. This is an issue like that. Likewise, I can come up with examples of spouses, where they become very toxic towards each other because they don't understand what the other spouse needs, what the person's rights are. So they just assume that whatever I want and whatever I like, the other person must necessarily accept the same things, right? But that's not how relationships work. You need to understand what the other person's needs are and so on, and things are customized according to that. And likewise, same thing for children. Sometimes you have siblings who are different, like they have an age gap, right? And so the older one, um, and the younger one might think that they should get the same everything, in terms of authority in the house and in terms of like like the trust of the parent and stuff, as the younger one, right? The younger one should get it as the same as the older one, right? But obviously there are differences and stuff like that that need to be accounted for. So for example, if the older child, the parents think that if this person is more responsible, they grew up and they understand how to like oversee the kids and stuff, then the parent might actually put a little bit more trust in the older child, right? And maybe not as much in the younger child, because the younger child is still learning and so on. And so in that case, the parents would be correct in doing that, right? Um, but the younger child needs to understand that. So like siblings can sometimes have these rivalries and stuff like that. As you know, um, in many different like a like a like a dictatorships or like kingdoms and so on, right? You'll see, for example, like rivalry between blood siblings. So they'll kill one another so that they can become the next person to inherit the throne, essentially, right? So they'll do that. That's also something that we don't do, because there's objectives between siblings and stuff, and rights and expectations and interaction. And then the same thing for relatives. Obviously, certain relatives might think, for example, that they have like pretty much open, like they have open book access to another family's like history and like daily interactions and so on. So they might get very nosy and things like that, right? So relatives need to understand their boundaries essentially. So there's a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of these kinds of examples that take place. And I know these personally, so maybe I'll share some of those stories inshallah with some of our cases that we come across. Um, and inshallah this will give you some more context. But I wanted to give you like an overview of relationships where steps 0, 1, and 2 can go right, but oftentimes when they don't go right and stuff, and where those situations come in from. So I know that I went a lot extra today, but I hope that it does like give you some overview inshallah, because mental health and like your relationships and so on is like a very, 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 very huge topic. And in fact, like this is how the entire world functions essentially. It's all about human interaction with other people and stuff, right? So understanding this is going to have understanding that there is a proper how, and if we don't learn it, that we're partaking in oppression and zulm and harm within our families and within our societies, is going to help us then inshallah actually go towards learning those rights and expectations and objectives and so on that we need to have in different relationships. And again, different relationships are going to have a different set of these, although there might be some general similarities, but there are also differences within different contexts. So if you don't understand that, and you're using your loved ones and your relationships, the people in your relationships, as guinea pigs for whatever you want to apply and whatever you think that they should accept or whatever, then that's obviously indicating that you're not actually fully committed to what's best for them. That you're not actually indeed the kind of loving person that you might tell yourself, right? So it's very important for you to go and learn these things. And if you're not learning them and you're not applying them, then you're treating your close ones as guinea pigs, and that's not how we interact with people. In fact, even, and I'm saying guinea pigs, but I want to make a point here that even with animals, the Prophet ﷺ has given us instructions. For example, we're not allowed to kill animals except if there is an objective behind it. And like the right of an animal is that if you hunt it, like if you're eating like a deer, for example, hunting a deer, or you're eating slaughtering a cow or whatever and stuff, right? If you're doing that, their haqq is that you actually eat it and you're not actually killing them for no reason. This is what the Prophet ﷺ said, that they have rights, right? And the right is that you actually, when you kill something, you eat it. That you're not just like doing it for sport or fun and stuff, right? So it's not okay for you to just go duck hunting, for example, and you're just randomly shooting them and you just like throw them away and stuff, right? Or you do trophies and stuff like that. You're just killing a deer just because you want to get its like horn and decorated in your house and stuff, right? That's not allowed in Islam. Islam has etiquette in terms of how you interact with everything around us: animals, insects, human beings, like actually the environment and so on. And there's a lot of actual authentic hadiths on this topic that there are out there that oftentimes we don't know. So we sort of play games with these kind of things, and we just sort of like do whatever we feel like doing, and that causes a lot of harm and oppression and so on. And that's what I'm trying to counter over here with this information that I wanted to go. So inshallah, next time we'll go into some more details in the sense of some actual cases that have happened, and some of the details or some of the lessons that we can extract from them in this example, inshallah. So today was just an overview of like how things can go wrong at a general level, but inshallah, moving forward, we're going to go into details by giving specific case studies, inshallah, specific examples. And obviously I'm not going to give names and so on, but I hope that we can benefit from those examples, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.